He leaned against his doorframe, arms crossed, and smiled at me like I was the most entertaining thing he had seen all week. He said, "Prove it was my boat. Good luck with that, neighbor." Then he laughed and shut the door in my face. I stood on his porch for 3 seconds, repair estimates in hand, $2,300 in documented damage to my car, and I made a decision right there. I did not knock again. I did not raise my voice. I turned around, walked back to my house, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened my Ring app. And when I saw what was waiting for me inside that app, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because Garrett Simmons had just made the most expensive mistake of his life, and he had absolutely no idea. I want to take you back to the beginning, because this story does not start with the boat, and it does not start with the damage. It starts with September, 14 months before that porch conversation, the day a moving truck pulled into the driveway of the house on my right and Garrett Simmons became my neighbor. I had owned my place on Crestfield Drive for 7 years by then. A 1,940 square foot Craftsman on a corner lot, 2-car driveway running along the north side, detached garage at the back. I was 31 when I bought it, had been saving for 6 years, and the down payment represented more than 4 years of deliberate, grinding financial discipline. I remember signing the closing documents on a Tuesday morning in late April, 52 degrees outside, one of those flat, gray Midwestern mornings where the trees are just beginning to bud. I sat in a title company conference room and thought about every Saturday I had not gone out, every vacation I had postponed, every upgrade I had skipped. Then I signed my name at the bottom of a document that said these 0.23 acres of America are yours. There is nothing abstract about property ownership when you have earned it that way. The driveway is not infrastructure. It is not a shared amenity. It is mine. Crestfield Drive looks like a photograph from a real estate catalog. Craftsman and colonial revival homes from the late 90s, mature oak and maple trees lining the sidewalks, lawns that go deep green every July while the sprinklers run before sunrise. In October, the whole block turns amber and rust, and the kids kick through leaf drifts on the way home from school. The woman on my left had lived there for 20 years. The family across the street hosted the 4th of July block party every single year without fail. For 5 years, I had not had a meaningful disagreement with a single person on that street. Then Garrett moved in, and the quality of my daily life began a slow deterioration I did not fully appreciate until it was too late to handle quietly. Garrett seemed friendly enough in those first few weeks. Mid-40s, stocky, the particular confidence of a man who has learned to occupy whatever space is available without asking whether it belongs to him. We had nodded at each other across the property line a dozen times. He had waved once when I was getting the mail. Ordinary neighbor things. But for nearly the first week he was there, I noticed something about the way he moved through the neighborhood, the way he parked his truck slightly past his own curb, the way his trash cans always ended up a foot or two onto the shared edge of the sidewalk, the way he treated every undefined boundary as an invitation. It was a pattern, and I recognized it, but I told myself it was nothing. I told myself he was still settling in. He had a truck, a sedan, and the boat. The boat was an 18-foot fiberglass center console on a single-axle galvanized steel trailer, the kind of rig that takes up the footprint of a full-size pickup when you account for the tongue extending forward. In the suburbs of Middle America, a boat like that is not just equipment. It is a statement. It says I earn enough to own this. I have the truck to haul it, and I have the confidence to put it wherever I decide it needs to go. Garrett had been making that statement his whole life. He had learned that most people step aside rather than challenge it directly. He moved onto my street and made the same calculation he had always made. He was wrong about me, but it would take him 14 months to find that out. The first morning the boat appeared in my driveway was 3 weeks after he moved in, early October. One of those warm golden mornings when the temperature sits around 68 degrees and the light through the maples makes everything look like it belongs on a postcard. I walked out to get my newspaper and found the trailer tongue resting just past my property line, the whole rig sitting at the edge of my space as casually as if it had always been there. I assumed it was a mistake. New neighbor, unfamiliar geometry, easy misunderstanding. I knocked on his door that afternoon. He was pleasant, almost apologetic, said it would not happen again. I believed him. 3 days later it was back. This time deeper, the trailer fully parked, blocking a lane and a half of my two-lane driveway. I knocked again. This time the apology was gone, and the explanation was in its place. He told me his own driveway was narrow, that the boat was awkward to maneuver, that he just needed a few minutes in the morning before heading to the lake. He said it was not a big deal. I told him calmly and directly that it was my property and I needed him to stop. He nodded and said sure. The boat kept coming back. Not every day, but consistently enough that within 6 weeks Garrett had decided, through repetition and the absence of consequences, that my driveway was available to him. That is how people like Garrett operate. They do not ask permission because they have learned that the longer an arrangement continues without legal consequence, the more entitled to it they become. Every morning that boat appeared without incident was another brick in the wall of precedent he was building, one quiet violation at a time. I asked him formally to stop a second time in November. I used the words property line and unauthorized use, and I am asking you clearly to stop. He gave me the patient, slightly condescending smile of a man who has spent a lifetime waiting people out. He said, "Relax, man. It's just a few minutes. I'm not hurting anything." I said, "You are parking your equipment on my property without my permission. That is trespassing." He shrugged and went back inside. And then on a Tuesday morning in early December, I was in the kitchen when I heard it. That specific gut-dropping metallic thud and scrape that you never mistake for anything else once you have heard it. The sound of something hard hitting your car. I set down my coffee and walked outside. There was a fresh crease in my driver's side door, paint chipped, metal deformed in a 2-inch arc at handle height. The trailer's steel fender was the obvious cause. When I looked closely, I could see a faint transfer of my car's paint color on its metal edge. I photographed the damage from 6 angles, photographed the trailer showing the paint transfer, photographed both vehicles and their positions on my property. The estimate from my body shop came back at $680. I knocked on Garrett's door and showed him the photos on my phone. He looked at them for 4 seconds, handed the phone back, and said the damage could have come from anywhere. I went home. I opened a new document on my laptop, typed the date, the time, the description, and the estimate, and saved the file. I did not know it yet, but that document was going to become the most expensive thing Garrett Simmons had ever had a neighbor write. 3 weeks later, a second impact. Same door, slightly lower, a longer drag where the trailer corner had caught the panel on a wide turn. Another round of photos, another estimate at $740, another conversation with Garrett in which he shrugged and suggested, with genuine casualness, that maybe I should park somewhere else if I was worried about it. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, "I park my car in my own driveway. That is where I park my car." He shrugged. I went back inside and added the second entry to my document. Then the third incident happened, and the third incident was the one that closed the door on any version of this ending quietly. It was a Saturday morning in late January, temperatures in the mid-20s, my car covered in a thin layer of frost. I heard it from inside the house. Not a single thud, but a long, sustained, grinding scrape. The kind of sound that tells you the damage is serious before you even look. I walked out and found a gouge running the full length of my driver's side panel from the front wheel well to the rear door, deep enough to expose primer in several sections. The estimate came back at $880. 3 incidents, $2,300 total, each one documented with photos, each one reported directly to Garrett, and each time he had looked at the evidence in my hand and decided it was not his problem. I gathered all 3 photo sets, all 3 estimates, my incident log, and I walked to his door one final time. He answered in a sweatshirt and basketball shorts, coffee in hand, completely unbothered. He looked at the estimates for 4 seconds. Then he handed them back, leaned against the doorframe, and said, "Prove it was my boat. Good luck with that, neighbor." He smiled when he said it. It was the smile of a man who genuinely believed the conversation was already over. It was the most expensive smile I have ever witnessed. I walked home. I sat down. I opened my Ring app, and I felt something shift in my chest, a cold and very specific kind of focus that I have only felt a handful of times in my life. The feeling that comes when you realize you have exactly what you need and the other person does not know it yet. I had installed the Ring Spotlight Cam 18 months earlier after a package theft on our block. It was mounted at the corner of my garage at an angle that captured a wide field view of the entire driveway, the street, and the property line. Motion triggered, night vision, every clip time-stamped and backed up to the cloud. I had not thought about that footage once in relation to Garrett. I had not needed to. But as I scrolled back through 14 months of event history that evening, clip after clip after clip, I began to understand what I was actually looking at. 23 separate incidents. The trailer's registration number visible in most of them. Garrett's face identifiable in 7, clearly stepping out of his truck to adjust the positioning or unhook the rig. And in 3 specific clips, corresponding exactly to the 3 damage incidents, the footage showed the precise moment of contact between his trailer and my car. The exact frame. The exact second. Every single thing he had done, recorded and preserved in waiting. I leaned back in my chair and watched one of those contact clips a second time. Then I closed the laptop, poured a glass of water, and went to bed. I slept easily. I knew exactly how this was going to end. The next morning, I created a master evidence folder, organized every clip by date and time with a brief description, flagged the 3 contact events separately, and transferred everything to a USB drive. I made a second backup on an external drive in my fireproof lockbox. Then I drove to the district police station before 9. I sat across from an officer in a reporting room, described the 3 incidents in order without editorializing, and handed her the USB drive. She asked to review the footage on the station's computer. We watched 3 clips together right there in the room. The first contact. The second contact. The full-length panel scrape in January. She did not say much while she watched. When the third clip ended, she looked at the repair estimates, wrote something in her notes, and said, "We'll get this filed today." I had the report number before I left the building. From my driveway, I called my insurance company. 9 years a customer, never filed a claim. When I reached my claims representative and explained the situation, 3 contact events, camera footage, police report filed that morning, there was a pause on the line. She said, "You said you have footage of all 3 incidents?" I said yes. Another pause. She said she was opening a subrogation file, which in plain terms means my insurer was now going to pursue Garrett's homeowner's policy directly for every dollar of my $2,300 in damage. I sent the evidence package by email within 20 minutes. By noon that Thursday, Garrett's name was in a police report and in an active insurance claim. He had no idea, but I was not finished, because the property damage was only the visible problem. The deeper problem was something that carried its own separate set of consequences entirely. Garrett had been using my private residential driveway as a staging area for a trailered watercraft on a recurring basis for nearly a year. In my municipality, that specific activity falls under Local Zoning Ordinance 14B, which governs the storage of recreational vehicles on residential properties and carries a fine of $175 per day per occurrence when the vessel is not registered to that address. I had read the ordinance the evening after I filed the police report. 23 documented occurrences at $175 each. $4,025 in potential municipal fines, every dollar backed by time-stamped footage with the trailer's registration number clearly visible. I submitted a formal complaint to the Code Enforcement Division the following morning, 4 pages with a cover letter, the complete incident index, and 5 representative video clips attached. The officer who took the complaint told me documentation cases were prioritized for review. I thanked him and closed my laptop. Then I made dinner, called my sister, and went to bed at a reasonable hour. I want you to understand how calm I felt. Not because I am a calm person by nature, but because I had done everything correctly and there was nothing left to do except wait. He said, "Prove it." I had 23 videos with timestamps, and I sent every single one to his insurance company. The 10 days that followed were the strangest of the entire 14 months. On the surface, nothing was happening. I went to work, came home, cooked dinner, called my sister on the weekend. Garrett's boat appeared in my driveway twice more during that stretch, and both times the Ring camera documented it automatically, and I noted it in my log without a word to anyone. But underneath the surface, 3 separate processes were running simultaneously against Garrett Simmons, all of them moving quietly and at their own pace toward the same destination. The police report was filed. The insurance subrogation claim was active. The code enforcement complaint was under review. I had set 3 clocks running at once, and Garrett did not know any of them existed. There were evenings during those 10 days when I sat in my living room and listened to the sound of his television through the shared wall between our houses. That particular muffled quality of sound traveling through drywall and insulation, and I thought about the fact that he was sitting 20 feet away from me with no idea what was coming. He had smiled on that porch. He had laughed. He had shut the door. And now he was watching television and thinking, if he was thinking about me at all, that the situation was resolved in his favor. That thought did not make me angry. It made me patient in a way I have rarely felt before or since. I want you to understand the specific quality of that patience. It was not the patience of someone waiting for justice to arrive. It was the patience of someone who has already delivered the package and is simply waiting for the recipient to open the door. On the 11th day, Garrett Simmons received a letter from the city's Code Enforcement Division. I know this because I was in my kitchen washing dishes when I heard his front door open and close with a force that was slightly too deliberate for a normal afternoon, followed by a single short word that carried clearly through my open window. He had opened an envelope and found a citation for one violation of Zoning Ordinance 14B. Specific date, specific time, registration. Number of his vessel, $175 fine payable within 30 days, and a line informing him that the violation had been documented through video evidence submitted with a formal complaint. I kept washing dishes. The following day, another envelope arrived. The day after that, 2 more arrived in the same afternoon. I watched from my front window as Garrett stood at his mailbox holding 3 envelopes, opening them one by one. I watched his face as he opened the first one. I watched it as he opened the second. By the third, his jaw had set in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with the dawning recognition that something was happening that he did not yet fully understand. That expression, that specific moment when a man who has been completely certain he is winning begins to understand that the game was never what he thought it was. That was the moment I had been patient for. By the end of the first week, he had received 7 citations. By the end of the second week, he had received all 23. 23 individual notices from the city, each citing a specific documented date and time, each carrying a $175 fine, totaling $4,025 in municipal penalties for zoning violations committed on my property, documented entirely by a camera he had never once thought to look for. The man who had told me to prove it was now holding the proof in both hands, envelope by envelope, standing at his own mailbox in the cold. His insurance company called me before his attorney did. The claims adjuster confirmed that the footage had been reviewed in full, that liability for all 3 contact events had been established, and that the $2,300 claim would be processed and paid to my carrier. She also told me, in the careful, measured language that insurance professionals use when delivering news that is professionally neutral but personally significant, that Garrett's homeowner's policy would be subject to a premium adjustment at his next renewal. When I asked what kind of adjustment, she said she was not able to give me a specific figure, but that claims of this nature typically result in material changes to annual rates. I later learned the adjustment was $1,800 per year, every year, for as long as that claim sat on his record. So at that point, we were looking at $4,025 in municipal fines, a $2,300 liability finding against his insurance, and $1,800 in annual premium increases. More than $8,000 in first-year consequences for a man who had smiled at me and told me to prove it. I thought about that smile a lot during those days. Not with anger, not anymore. More with the particular satisfaction of a calculation that has finally resolved exactly the way the math always said it would. On a Wednesday evening, my phone rang with a number I did not recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from an attorney identifying himself as representing Garrett Simmons in connection with, quote, certain zoning enforcement matters and related insurance proceedings. He had the careful, controlled voice of a professional who has been hired to begin a damage limitation conversation without appearing to concede anything. He said his client was interested in exploring whether a resolution could be reached, and that one element of that resolution might involve my withdrawing the active code enforcement complaint. He asked me to return the call at my convenience. I listened to that voicemail twice. Then I went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, sat back down at my kitchen table, and thought about what I actually wanted. Not the maximum I could theoretically extract. Not some abstract idea of winning. What I actually wanted, as a specific person who had spent 14 months being slowly and deliberately disrespected by a neighbor who had assumed I would fold like everyone before me had folded. The answer was the same answer it had always been, and it fit into 3 sentences. I wanted my $2,300. I wanted a legally enforceable guarantee it would never happen again. and I wanted a written acknowledgement from Garrett Simmons himself, signed by him personally, that what he had done was wrong. That was the complete list. I called the attorney back the following morning. I was polite, direct, and completely unmovable. 3 conditions, non-negotiable, all 3 required before any discussion of withdrawing anything. First, a formal written apology from Garrett Simmons personally, signed by him, specific in its acknowledgement of the 3 damage incidents and the extended unauthorized use of my property. Second, a signed agreement prohibiting Garrett or any vehicle or vessel registered to him from entering or using my driveway for any purpose for a minimum of 3 years, with a liquidated damages clause of no less than $500 per violation in the event of a breach. Third, full reimbursement of $2,300 in documented vehicle damage paid directly to me by personal check, separate from and in addition to whatever his insurance carrier was processing through the subrogation claim. Until all 3 conditions were satisfied in writing, I told the attorney I had no interest in withdrawing any complaint, modifying any action already taken, or having any further conversation about resolution. He said he would relay the terms to his client. I said that was fine and ended the call. The entire conversation took less than 4 minutes. He did not push back on a single condition. I noticed that. The signed documents arrived at my door 6 days later, delivered by courier in a sealed manila envelope. I opened them at my kitchen table with my morning coffee. The apology letter was 2 paragraphs, signed by Garrett Simmons in ink, acknowledging specifically that he had parked his boat trailer on my property without permission on multiple occasions, that 3 of those incidents had resulted in documented damage to my vehicle totaling $2,300, and that his conduct had been inappropriate and disrespectful of my property rights. I read it twice. The language was precise and unambiguous. His attorney had written it, but Garrett's signature was at the bottom, which meant the acknowledgement was his, legally and permanently, attached to his name for as long as the document existed. The driveway prohibition agreement was 4 pages, drafted carefully, containing the 3-year prohibition and the $500 per violation liquidated damages clause, signed and notarized. The personal check for $2,300 was drawn on Garrett's own account, not his insurance company's, which told me his carrier had clawed that portion back from him directly as part of the subrogation settlement. I made photocopies of everything, placed the originals in the fireproof lockbox alongside my mortgage documents and property deed, and put the check in an envelope to deposit that afternoon. I want to tell you about the drive home from the bank, because it was one of the more unusual emotional experiences of this whole thing. It was a Friday afternoon in early March, about 44 degrees, the sky that pale flat gray that means winter is still there, but losing the argument. I drove home on surface streets instead of the highway. No particular reason, just not in a rush. I passed the body shop where my car had been repaired 2 weeks earlier. I passed the district police station where an officer had watched 3 clips of footage on a government computer and said we will get this filed today. I passed the annex building that houses the Code Enforcement Division. All 3 of those institutions had done exactly what they exist to do when someone brings them properly organized evidence. That is the part of this story I think gets lost in the telling sometimes. The system worked. Not because I was lucky, not because I knew anyone, not because I was unusually aggressive or connected. It worked because I had documentation that made it impossible for it not to work. The camera was the weapon. The footage was the ammunition. Everything else was just process. When I pulled back on a Crestfield Drive and turned into my driveway, the first thing I noticed was that Garrett's trailer was parked fully on his own property, tucked back toward his garage, sitting entirely on his land for what felt like the first time. I pulled in and cut the engine and sat in the car for a moment looking at my driveway, which was empty and clean and completely undisturbed, exactly as a driveway that belongs to one person and one person only should always be. My neighbor 2 doors down was raking the last of the winter debris from his lawn. The golden retriever across the street was sitting on the front porch watching the street with the dignified patience that golden retrievers seem to be born with. A completely ordinary Friday afternoon on a quiet suburban block. That is how every Friday afternoon on this street should have felt from the beginning. That evening, I walked over to a few neighbors, including the woman who had lived on the block for 20 years, and told them briefly how things had resolved. Not to poison anyone's opinion of Garrett. but because I thought they deserved to know that the things some of them had quietly watched for over a year had an ending, and that the ending was documented and legally binding. The woman who had been there for 20 years listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He did the exact same thing to the couple in the blue house 2 streets over. About 3 years ago. They just let it go." She said it quietly, the way you say something you have known for a long time and never had quite the right moment to bring up. I stood there in the early March cold and thought about that couple in the blue house. I thought about the version of this story where I had let it go too, where I had moved my car, absorbed the $2,300, told myself the conflict was not worth it, and watched Garrett take his smile and his shrug and his boat to the next property line and the next person who might not push back. I thought about how easy that choice would have been. I thought about how many people make it. And I thought about what it costs them, not just in dollars, but in the slow erosion of something harder to name, the sense that your property, your space, your clearly stated no actually means something and will be defended if it has to be. The camera is still up, still recording, still motion-triggered, still time-stamped, and backed up every night. Garrett's boat has not appeared in my driveway since the day the documents were signed. His truck passes my house occasionally in the morning, and sometimes I see it through the kitchen window while I am making coffee. He does not wave. I do not wave either. We have arrived at the most functional possible version of a relationship between 2 people who have no business having any relationship at all, which is complete mutual indifference enforced by a notarized legal agreement and a 14-month archive of high-definition footage sitting in a fireproof lockbox next to the deed that says these 0.23 acres of America are mine and no one else's without my permission. My car sits in my driveway every morning without a mark on it. My property line is respected, and I have a signed apology, in ink, from a man who stood on his porch and told me I could never prove anything. I take it out sometimes, not often, just occasionally, and I read the second paragraph, the one where he acknowledges specifically that his conduct was inappropriate and disrespectful. Then I fold it back along the same creases, put it in the locked box, close the lid, and go make coffee. That is enough. That has always been enough. He told me to prove it. I had 23 videos with timestamps, and I sent every single one to his insurance company. And before you go, I want to leave you with something I have not been able to stop thinking about since this whole thing ended. There is a version of what I did that looks like justice, measured and proportionate, a man defending his property through legal channels and prevailing on the merits. And there is another version that looks like something closer to war, methodical and total, designed not just to stop the behavior, but to make the cost of it so overwhelming that no similar calculation could ever be made again. I know which version I believe I was operating in, but I want to know which version you see when you look at the full picture. Because somewhere out there right now, there is a Garrett standing at someone else's property line, smiling, making the same calculation he has always made, counting on the same silence he has always counted on. And somewhere out there is the person he is smiling at. Drop a comment below and tell me, what would you have done differently? And if the answer is nothing, then I want to know this instead. At what point does being completely right stop being enough? And what does it cost the rest of us when people like Garrett keep finding out that it is?